Right, my title for today, as you know, is TBA. That's in the program. This is a very efficient title. It's a three-letter acronym, which is short for Trying to Be Accurate. That's what my talk is about. To put it another way, you might call it On the Prevention of Horses. You may be able to hear already that I'm a little hoarse myself. I'm coming down with a cold, so I may be a little slow, and forgive me if I am. I'm thinking through cotton wool at the moment. Right then, this word accurate, what does it mean? Here is a dictionary definition, thanks to Apple. I don't know which dictionary they stole this from. Accurate means correct in all details, or it means capable of giving accurate information. That's a circular definition if there ever was one. Providing a faithful representation of someone or something. I really like that one. And then there's the thing about weapons or missiles or shots, or indeed computational systems, capable of or successful in reaching the intended target. Using target slightly metaphorical there. I like the definition of this. Look, from Latin, accuratus, done with care. Care. That's nice, isn't it? That's what the scientific method's all about, taking care. So, when I was planning this talk, and indeed all of this morning, I was terrified because I knew I was going to be preceded by 4 excellent speakers, all of whom might say exactly the same thing that I wanted to say. Fortunately, they've all said things which are related, or indeed parts of what I was going to say, but not the same, so that's good. And hopefully this is going to be a bit of a sort of pulling together of some of the issues that have come out of this morning's excellent presentations. This is the theme, all the way through. Okay, so sometimes when we're looking at models, it's useful to step back and ask why we're doing what we are doing. Sometimes it's useful to step back and ask what it is we are doing as well, actually, because sometimes we can lose track of that. So all the way through my career, I've always gone through this process of consciously stopping every couple of years and thinking, actually, what did I do there? And trying to self-criticize. And I think this is a helpful thing to do. Okay, so broadly speaking, and these are very broad claims here, I'm not saying they're exhaustive in any sense, there are 2 reasons that we might want to study machine learning. One is to be able to facilitate some kind of prediction from a body of unstructured data, where we don't really know what's going on, and we want to try and make the machine find out for us. Okay. Now, there are 2 ways you could look at that. One, you could say it was really lazy, right? That we're not going to bother, we're just going to let the machine do the work. The other we could say is that it's a fantastic tool to enable us to get at information that would otherwise be unacceptable. So there are 2 ways to look at that. Then the other reason for doing it is to understand what methods machines can learn. Or by what methods machines can learn, yeah. So really, if you're studying machine learning and you're doing the former of these things, then actually you're applying in another domain, and arguably, if you're not very careful, you're going into a domain about which you know diddly squat, right? Nothing at all. And that is the biggest danger for machine learning colleagues, in my opinion, and I'm going to wax lyrical about that later on. Being keynote here, I have an opportunity to rant, and I'm going to rant a fair bit in this, so forgive me if it gets tedious, and it's not personal, of course. All right, we want to supersede human involvement because it's difficult and it's slow and all of those things. Know about that. Right, so let's think about what a model is for a start. So I'm not so much talking about the process of machine learning, I'm talking about a model. And these are 3 of the possible definitions. Again, I'm not claiming that this is exhaustive. So the first thing, which is what I think most machine learning people would agree with, it's a mathematical structure of some kind which is learned from some body of data and from which predictions can be made about that data. I worded that very carefully. Predictions can be made about that data. Is that okay as a definition? Yeah. All right. If you're a psychologist, an empirical psychologist, the chances are that when you say a model, you mean a 0th order statistical distribution that matches observed data. That's very likely. Not for everybody, but that's probably what it means. I'm not very good at saying the word statistical, by the way, for which I apologize. And then the thing that I mean when I say model is the overall theory surrounding either of these 2 or both and involving its applications to the world. So what I personally am interested in doing is modeling cognition. And I wouldn't claim that if I build one of these things, it is a model of cognition. One of these things might be a component of a model of cognition. But for me to be building a model of cognition, I have to have a theory which is embodied in my program, which matches the observed behavior that I'm trying to model. Okay, so what's a model for in this context? Well, one thing is that it can give us some precise description of observed phenomena. That's not the kind of model that most machine learning people are interested in. It is the kind of model that most psychologists are interested in. Exploration of behavior of phenomena, that's the kind of model that pretty much everybody's interested in. Prediction of unobserved phenomena. Well, in machine learning, we have a kind of process where we withhold data and we sort of say, well, that's kind of unobserved from the perspective of the model. Let's see if we can predict it and stuff like this. In psychology, of course, it's a completely different matter because you always know that you don't have a complete data set. You always remember, you have to remember that you have a complete data set. That's true in machine learning, but it's, well, usually true, but it's not always remembered. Hypothesis generation, Mathieu mentioned that already, and the scientific method and all of these things. And how many people here, let's do disclosure for a minute. How many people here who work in machine learning could genuinely say they use the scientific method? Okay. All right, those who didn't put your hand up, do you think it matters? Yeah, some people do. Okay. All right. And then another reason we might want models is to explain things. And that's where it starts to get really difficult because our black box models don't really explain very many things. I just want to point out a particular paper by my colleague Henk-Jan Honing. He's a long-standing leader in the music psychology and AI field. This is a very nice paper looking at the problems of model selection, and in particular when you're doing computational modeling of music cognition. When we're working in the music psychology area, computational modelers have a problem, which is that nobody really understands what we do. They think that we make the same kind of model that everybody else makes in cognitive science, and we don't, of course. We make these process models, which are different kinds of things. So every now and again you get a situation in a conference where there is a session on computational modeling, which might be about every single possible aspect of music psychology. And then each one of those aspects of music psychology has its own session elsewhere in the conference. And of course what that does is it completely tears things apart. The point of the modeling is not to be computational, it's to be a model of the behavior that we're interested in looking at. So that's not understood. Anyway, Henk-Jan's point here is that the thing we really need to do whenever we're doing some kind of model selection in a computational context is that we need to drive those models as hard as we possibly can, even exhaustively if that's possible, and we need to find the predictions they make and choose the ones which are the most surprising to us as humans. Okay? So his suggestion is that we have a duty as part of our scientific method to use these things to squeeze out new hypotheses, and hypotheses that we didn't really expect, which would then be rather likely to falsify the model. So there's falsificationism coming back in, and the scientific method. I recommend this paper to everyone. It's very good. Right. So now the next slide is going to be the sort of, well, it's not novel, but this is a sort of methodological contribution that I'm trying to put forward here. And it's really quite hard to explain. I've tried several times now. I haven't, as far as I know, completely succeeded yet, which is to claim that there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of model. There's a kind of model which is descriptive. So it describes a phenomenon objectively and as completely as possible. And it says, this is what happens. So a very famous example of this in psychology is the Gestalt Theory, where we say there are certain phenomena, the way we see things, the way we hear things, other things too, which are very clearly describable. And we can predict what is going to happen from this description. But there is no attempt at all in the early Gestalt psychology work to explain why. It's purely a description of what. Okay, now that is a very valuable thing, because unless you have that description, you can't start to explain why. But it isn't enough. You have to go beyond this. And of course now, in later years, people are doing so. And then The other kind of model, which fills that gap, is the explanatory model. So that explains a phenomenon objectively and completely explains a phenomenon. Basically, it says this is how this happens. Okay, so going back to psychology again, that zeroth order idea where we just take a distribution and we say, well, look, this population is this likely to be something. That doesn't give you anything here on the explanatory side. It's only on the descriptive side because there's no notion of causality there. Right, my favorite example for this is weather forecasting. Weather forecasting has been of great interest in Britain and elsewhere, of course, but particularly in Britain for a very long time. So we have adages like red sky at night, shepherd's delight. That's weather forecasting. It's very, very ancient weather forecasting. To put that down a little bit more clearly, what we might be able to do, maybe back in, I don't know, 200 years ago, we might be able to get a nice big leather-bound book and write down the weather conditions for every day in very great detail and follow through. And thereby be able to look up the weather conditions for any subsequent day on the basis of what we've seen before and make a prediction about what came the next day, maybe. So that's a sort of what I would call a predictive model. The reason I would call it a predictive model is because it merely describes the phenomenon. It doesn't get into anything about why the phenomenon is what it is. On the other hand, today's weather forecasting actually goes right down to the level of physics in doing the weather forecasting. We have finite element analysis across the entire globe, and within the finite element analysis, the behavior of the rules that are applied to those finite elements are actually based on the physics of individual, well, to some degree, individual molecules even. Of course, they're integrated across, but nevertheless, that's what's going on. So that's an explanatory model, because it can say, well, over there it's going to get hotter, and the reason is specifically because energy moves in this way, and so on. Okay. So I hope it's clear what I mean by those two things. And I've written about them a couple of times in these two papers. If anybody wants references, I can give them links later. Now, you may be thinking, aha, but this is just the same as David Marr. Is anybody thinking that? No? Okay. I'm surprised. Well, it is kind of the same as David Marr in one particular sense, but it's also the same as what they did sometime before David Marr and what Pilishin did afterwards. Okay, so this is the same kinds of thinking. It's about abstraction, and that's another word that came up in Mathieu's talk. When we're trying to do a model, we can't just say, oh, look, here's some data, let's model it. We've got to say, does this data all fit together? Is this data in some sense uniform, in that it's describing the thing we're trying to model in a consistent way? Because if that's not the case, then our learning system not only has to learn the thing we're trying to model, it also has to learn the discrepancies in the data. And that makes things harder. It also makes it harder for us to understand. Now, Clamrock, who's a philosopher of science, has argued differently for multiple levels in this, and that's where I would go. Okay, so layers of abstraction. Models aren't just metaphors. They have to be precise operational formalisms. I don't need to tell anyone that in this room. They need to have a well-defined syntax in a one-to-one correspondence with the intended interpretation of the model. So that's a computer program, that's what that says. And they have to have a well-defined semantics, which means there are operational rules that give symbols meaning. So a symbol without explicit formal rules is not a model, it's only a notation, but that's still a useful start. Now, note, for the sake of argument, that the descriptive kind of model I was talking about is something more than just a notation, because it does allow you to make inferences by saying, here's something I recognize, and after the something I recognized, something else happened in the past. Okay, so this is even less than a descriptive model. But often, again, in psychology, if you look at early cognitive science, for example, this was happening all the time. People were writing down clever notations for things and thinking that they'd got a model, and that was not the case. So that model is somehow self-contained. Its symbols must express all and only the possible values of the data. Its rules must express all and only the possible operations. You notice I'm not specifically talking about models here which are learned. They might be programmed as well. Okay, more on levels of abstraction. these things are probably obvious to you, but it's worth rehearsing them anyway to make sure we know what we mean. So if we look at biology, biology is, as a field, in fact, organized in multiple levels of abstraction. So you have social biologists, you have organismal, I think, biologists, you have people who are interested in the functions of groupings of organs, then you have biochemists. Underneath the biochemists somewhere you've got the physicists, and so on. So these are all different levels of abstraction. It doesn't follow that since I've given one way of abstracting biological structure out, that that's the only one. There can be multiple, and they can interact. Okay. Music is a similar thing. We have an audio signal. There's no structure in the audio signal at all except the time sequence. That's it. On the other hand, music is often described as the organization of sound in time. So we need to be able to organize sound into things like notes, chords, and all of that kind of stuff. We need to look at time, and in music, we're interested in expressive timing, the way time is kind of moved around to convey things and so on. And then there's things like emotional responses, which I would argue are not even in the signal. I'm going to come back to that later. Okay. At each one of these levels, if we're careful about it, we don't need to worry about how the next level down works. We only have to worry about what it does. So we talked about black boxes, or indeed block boxes we had earlier on, I think, at one point, which we can do that recursively. And that's really the methodology that I think we need to use. Okay. Way back when, in that decade that Tim was referring to of neural networks, which is when I learned about machine learning, showing how old I am, actually, a lot of the early AI work consisted of careful distilling of rules, by hand, case-by-case conditional rules. And we did the same in early psychology, too, rules from careful empirical observation, the Gestalt principles. These things are descriptive, but that doesn't mean they can't make useful predictions. But they're just predicting at that particular level. What's more, they can't explain, why a particular prediction holds. They can just say it does. Doesn't mean they're useless. And the level of the level of precision needed for a good descriptive model is the same as that needed to begin to derive an explanatory one. So there's the beginning of a methodology. Start by describing as thoroughly as you can, and then maybe you can explain afterwards. But don't try to explain before you've described, because you don't know what it is you're trying to explain. When you put it like that, it sounds obvious, but people don't necessarily do it. Okay. And then the other thing is, having said, yeah, descriptive modeling is important, if you stay there, then you're not ever going to explain anything. And this is a problem now in music cognition research. Lots and lots of people are stuck at the level of hand-coded, well, probabilistic maybe, but hand-coded rules, which do not really give us any explanation of why the phenomena are modelled at all, why they work the way they do at all. Okay. More modern AI, of the kind that has left me behind probably, is heavily biased towards learned models. They can be non-symbolic, in which they're very flexible, very powerful, but usually inscrutable. That, of course, is changing. I mean, Tim just gave us a nice example of how you can make something that was previously very inscrutable by making it small enough, right? It's got to be quite a small model to do that. And not, of course, all models are small. Symbolic models are sometimes self-explanatory, and even if they're not self-explanatory, you can have a look inside and see what the hell's going on. Okay. And then not all learned models are the same. Somebody already this morning, I forget who, made the distinction between supervised learning and unsupervised learning implicitly by saying that supervised learning has particular horsey problems, maybe implying that unsupervised learning has different problems. Maybe they're not so horsey, I don't know. Okay, so now this is me being a little bit of a devil's advocate here. I don't necessarily believe this in a strong sense, but we could argue that supervised learning could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It works simply because we tell it the answers, and it doesn't tell us anything directly about the phenomenon from which the data came, because we don't make any claim about the mechanism that we're using for the learning, or the mechanism that we're using for the generation of outputs from the learning as being a model of that phenomenon. Now, that doesn't always matter. Okay? Clearly, it doesn't always matter, but sometimes, and a lot of the time, in fact, it does. The thing that it tells us the most is this. It tells us about the capacity of the learning system to capture the data, one way or another, either correctly or incorrectly. And that may be an interesting thing if you're a machine learning specialist, but if you're a machine learning applier, it's probably not very interesting at all. Okay. So, in supervised learning, the system learns the relationship between inputs and given outputs, various different ways to express that, basically curve fitting, and then, as I said, because I learned machine learning back in the 80s and 90s, I talk about a perceptron net with backprop, learning some kind of continuous function of its inputs. Okay. So then successful training of that net on a task tells us that that task can be modeled as a continuous function to the level of accuracy that we've made the net learn it, and it doesn't tell us anything else at all, really. It might allow us to make some predictions if our model is correct. Why should our model be correct? Why on earth should it be correct? It might be, by chance, but presumably, if it's going to be correct by chance, then it's less likely that it would be correct than incorrect. Okay. So in order to make it so, we need to exhaustively explore the parameter space of the net to say anything more. We can hold out as many test sets as we like and keep on. You know, we can start off by training and testing, and then we can have the holdout set. We keep on doing that. But until we've exhaustively explored the parameter space, then we can't say that the net is correct. It's a black box. And that inscrutability is a barrier to progress. Okay, though this is quite a strong claim. Unsupervised learning, if successful, can tell us more. Doesn't necessarily, but it can. In particular, it can tell us about the learning system, because if we are not telling the thing the answers, and the process to which we apply to our data gives us answers that we believe are correct, then that's telling us something about the process. Because we're not pushing it in the right direction. The process is giving us the right answers. It also tells us that there are regularities in the data we have that can be used for prediction given the learning system in our particular context. And here is the big point of all of this. This learning attempt should not be theory-free. We should have some idea as to why it should work. Because statistical correlations do not tell us anything about causality. You all know that. But we carry on doing it anyway, don't we? We all know that, but we carry on doing it anyway. Okay. Now then, anybody read Lakatos? Hey, some people. Good. I would recommend everybody to read Lakatos, because I actually believe that Lakatos said what Popper really meant. Yeah? So Popper gives this really heavy-duty, reductionist approach to scientific method, which relies on everything being falsification, absolutely everything. Lakatos, on the other hand, lightens up a bit and says, well, look, here is the way that we can develop a research program in a social context where we can start talking about things reasonably without trying to doubt ourselves absolutely all the time and becoming paranoid as a result. Okay, so observed phenomena. In case anyone doesn't know, because there are lots of people I don't know here, my observed phenomena are almost always music. Sometimes they're language. But that's neither here nor there. This applies across the world. Right, so this is now starting to summarize what I've been saying over the past maybe 20 minutes. We want to define our phenomena. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, we need a symbol system which represents all and only the phenomena that we wish to capture in our model. And we want to think very carefully in terms of our observations of what level of abstraction we're talking about. So what do I mean by that? Well, in music, humans perceive different things. We have words for different aspects of music which serve as agreed codes for things which are general percepts. So the notion of a note. A note, in the real world, is made up of a structure of harmonics. Everyone who's done O-level physics knows that, or GCSE physics knows that. But the bottom line is, unless you're a very, very good trained and practiced listener, you cannot pick out the harmonics of those notes. All you hear is the fused percept. Right? So this thing is somehow important to humans. There are evolutionary arguments as to why. I don't propose to go into them now. And that, perhaps, can give us a level of abstraction. Likewise, chords in music. That's a number of notes played together simultaneously. Now here's a really interesting thing. You have to learn to pick out the notes in a chord. Most people can hear the different characters of chords, but if you ask them to identify what the individual notes are in the middle of the chords, they can't do it. You have to learn this as a trainee musician. Okay. So there again, it's another kind of closed percept. Now, musicians talk about these things as common currency, but they tend to talk about them in levels. So you wouldn't normally talk about notes if you're talking about chords, unless perhaps you're talking about combining chords in some kind of accompaniment and notes in some kind of melody over a time sequence. There's another way the abstractions come in. So in music, there's a really nice given, which is human perception, which allows us to start, at least to propose levels of abstraction at which we can work, which make sense and which are self-contained. And that makes our problem easier. And then we can build a descriptive model. Oh, don't know why I got two coming out there. Having got a descriptive model, perhaps we can build an explanatory model. And the beautiful thing about music is that descriptive model number one is good old music theory. Because for the past 450 odd years, music theorists have been sitting around thinking precisely about how to describe music in terms of the percepts that are the common currency of music. It doesn't cover everything by any means, but it covers an awful lot. So that's a really useful thing. But then we need to explain a bit more about what's going on. And for me, what's going on is certainly in the mind. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Having got this, our explanatory model, the explanatory model kind of fits underneath. It supports the descriptive model. And remember, that descriptive model is at a particular level of abstraction. That's why it's where it is on the slide. But this guy here now is decomposable. By virtue of the fact that it's a mechanism that explains this, I can start to take it apart. I can propose new black boxes, which are smaller than the black box above. And at that point, I now have a descriptive model at the lower level of abstraction of mechanism. Indeed, I may have a number of descriptive models, all of which fit together at this explanatory level to underpin the descriptive model above. And then perhaps I can give an explanatory model that is a further level of detail here. If I'm really lucky, and I got it right the first time, what I'll be doing as I go down these blue models is I'll be going into the successive subroutines of my computational model. But the chances of my getting it right like that are quite small. So at some point, I'm probably going to come to a point at which that is no longer true. If I'm really lucky, I can do this, so that then I can start to compartmentalize in my model in various different ways and reduce the problem. So it's a classic reductionist approach. And then I carry on down however far I want to go. So this is describing recursive black box research. But it's doing so by adding in this extra flavor of thinking in a disciplined way about, first of all, describing something and then explaining it, and then treating that explanation as a descriptive model at the next layer down. A nice feature of this is that we don't have to start at the top or the bottom to do useful science. We can start in the middle if we know exactly where the middle is in terms of our levels of abstraction. A really nice example of this, for those of you who work in music science, is the distinction between audio signals and score-based representations. Score-based representations correspond very well indeed with low-level perceptual representations of music. But people who work with score-based representations, this is a rant, people who work with score-based representations are often pushed off into a corner of, oh, the symbolic approaches, they're not really doing it properly because they're not using audio. Okay. The point is that those symbolic approaches, if they're good symbolic approaches, are precisely representing the things that are perceived as a process of understanding music. So they lie somewhere in between the audio signal and the big thing up at the top that is music. I'm going to come on to what that might be in a minute. Okay. Right, this is coming back to what we can do once we've got such things. So we've got our data, we've got our level of abstraction approach appropriate to the subject of study, And again, we need to think about that. And then we're a learning system which is defined independently from the syntax of representation. That's not surprising. And then we've got an emergent behavior which should correctly predict observations. What's more, we should be able to take, according to Honing, we should be able to take the predictions of this system and test whether it predicts observations which have not been previously observed. Here's another idea, the metamodel. Meta means beyond. Right? Certainly in ancient Greek, it might mean something different now. I think it might mean after in modern Greek. Anyhow, here is an example of how we can produce evidence for a model. So this is work that we did based on Marcus Pearce's PhD work, the idiom model for melodic expectation, with Daniel Müllensiefen as well. We have corpora of music, symbolic ones in this case. We have an essential note percept level. That's the basis of all of this, notes in time. We have an unsupervised learning system which makes expectancy predictions. We can test these against humans. Why should it be against humans? I'll come back to that in a moment. We have another unsupervised learning system built on top of that which can predict segmentation. So this bit of the model is better than any other model in the literature. It agrees with humans as well as humans agree with each other, which is the best you can do in this context. This one is not quite the best, but it's the best unsupervised one. Okay, so that all works for music, and you go to a general machine learning conference and say, oh yeah, and people say, oh yeah, but that's about music, isn't it? It's not very interesting. So then we try to give some extra weight to all of this by taking a language corpus, in this case a corpus of phoneme strings, which represent utterances, real human utterances, and we feed that into the model. And we do the same thing with it again. And we haven't actually done the predictions. We haven't done the prediction studies on this, but we have done the segmentation studies. And sure as hell, we get out words and words and syllables and so on at various different levels. So the idea here is to say this thing is somehow giving evidence for this as a cognitive process which supersedes the evidence from here, because there was never any intention to take the model onto language, but it works there anyway. So then we can claim that we can make a stronger claim that we've got a model here that is doing something that is really to do with perception of things that occur as sequences in time, which is the claim we make. All right, coming back to music now. We're into the final straight, if I may carry on with the horse analogy. Milton Babbitt. Anyone heard of Milton Babbitt? Yeah? Yes, okay, the composers have all heard of him. So if you come to the concert next Wednesday, you will hear a new piece by Milton Babbitt, composed only last week. And that's remarkable because Milton Babbitt, unfortunately, is no longer with us. However, his compositional method is very well understood. And so we have a computer program which is capable of using that compositional method to produce new music. Okay. However, this slide is not about his music, it's about his theoretical thinking. So he suggested, and nothing happened there, let's try again. He suggested that we might want to divide music up into various different domains, domains of representation he's talking about. So acoustic, that's the waves in the air. Graphemic is what you write in a score. Of course, when you talk about computers, it starts to get a bit unclear because you can represent the acoustic thing using a computer as a WAV file, but then surely isn't that a graphemic representation? But you can represent a score on the computer, and then that becomes a graphemic representation of a graphemic representation. Let's leave that stuff aside. Let's just say we've got sound, we've got things like scores, I would include CDs and stuff in the graphemic there, and we can do this. We can record things, and we can play back things. Okay? That requires no human intervention except pushing the play button or the record button. But this is the interesting part, the auditory domain. And again, these are Babbitt's words now, not mine. And so you can see from the acoustic we've got listening, and then the auditory we've got performing going down to the acoustic, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, the real music here, the stuff that involves composing or playing or doing musical things, as opposed to merely reproducing music that has been produced elsewhere, goes through the auditory. So you need a brain in the way, effectively. And this is something which is almost Not always. It's often completely ignored in music information retrieval work. Completely ignored. This is what matters, and that is where music comes from. The rest is just notation for that. Even that is effectively notation for that. So to summarize all of that, the source of music is in the mind. What's the audio then? It's sound. It's not music at all. It's sound which will stimulate the production of music when someone listens to it. That's the way we need to think about this. And that means that any model we need to build, if we're going to build computational models of music, is actually a model of musical behavior, because it's the cognitive thing that we're modeling. It's not the thing in the signal at all, because the thing isn't in the signal. The signal is just the stimulus. And this has implications for evaluation, of course. Okay? Another little rant coming up. Evaluation is subjective. You knew that. Here's a quote from a research paper which was reviewed and published in an international conference in 1998. Section, evaluation. We listened to a large number of the generated tunes, and they sounded quite good. End of section. International conference, reviewed. Yeah? So we've come a long way since then. That's quite good. And we heard about subjectivity earlier this morning in the context of generation. Of course, generation is different from modeling, but nevertheless. So we really need to think a little bit harder about how to do this kind of stuff. And the psychologists have thought incredibly hard about these things. So perhaps we should go and talk to them a bit and find out, even if we don't use the psychological aspects, the mathematical methods are great. So we should really use them. The subtlety of the kinds of things that the psychologists do is fantastic. And we miss out on this in machine learning. But it isn't just a matter of using statistical methods. When you're talking about music, you have to be modeling psychology, the psychological reality, or it simply won't work, because it's the psychological reality that defines music. Music doesn't have any existence out there. There's no physical definition of what music is. So philosophically speaking, not including psychological measures is a problem. Now, oh, sorry, I went too far there. That doesn't mean that every model has to be explanatory. But it does mean that it has to be descriptive, and it has to be descriptive of the psychology, not of some other thing. Let's see now. I'm just going to try to prove this to you. I need a volunteer, please. I won't ask you to sing. No, it can't be you, Bob, because you might be a plant. Volunteer for a little study? Oh, come on, be brave. You have to come down here. Okay, while Oded is coming down, I'm now going to tell you that you guys are the people who are taking part in this study, not him. He's going to be the observer. Some of you, I know, have seen this before, so please keep stum about that. Oded is going to tell you and me what you did during the following. I'm going to play you an audio stimulus. I hope it'll work. And I'm going to ask you to shut your eyes. Really important that you shut your eyes, because if you see what other people are doing, then it's not going to work. Okay. I'm going to ask you to listen to a stimulus, and I'm going to ask you to hold your hands up like this so that Oded can see them, and beat the time that you hear in the stimulus. Okay? It's not rocket science, and no one is going to video you and make fun of you afterwards or anything like that. Just Oded is going to tell us what he sees as a whole, not about individuals. Right, let's see if the audio works. Thank you for setting that up, Bob. Shut your eyes quickly, and put your hands up and do the... And relax. Okay, what did you see?
I think most people were tapping with the fast beat, but various people were doing different subdivisions. So you had like people were tapping it as triplets or as semiquavers or as quavers.
Absolutely. So in other words, people were grouping things. Thank you, Oded. Round of applause for my beautiful assistant. So Okay, now here's the thing. That set of pulses there that you heard, once they'd faded in and faded, I mean, apart the steady state part, but you know, in between the fade in and the fade out, they were all identical, absolutely identical. But people were hearing a beat. And the thing is, when you do hear a beat there, you really do hear a beat. It's not just that you're grouping. You can hear the difference. They sound different. That's called the Tick-Tock effect, and it's measurable in psychology. It is more likely to happen if you're a trained performing musician than if you're not. So it's a learned thing. Okay, so that's one thing. What I showed you there was that you hear things in the most simple of musical stimuli which are not there. Now I'm going to ask you to do another thing. This is really quite difficult, and it might be loud, so I'll turn that down. Right, I'm now going to play you two melodies, and I'm going to play you them both at once. They're going to be interleaved. And the game, and it might be a bit tiring, is to put your hand up, one hand up when you've recognized one of them, and then the other hand up when you've recognized the other. Okay? So what I hope to see is everybody's sitting like this by the end. And then I will take a photograph of you and put it on the web. Okay. Two well-known melodies. Well, it's a relief when it stops, isn't it? Okay, so would somebody like to propose what the first one they heard was? Farajaka, absolutely. The second one? God Save the Queen. Yes, indeed. Okay, so what was I doing there? I started them off in the same audio register, and I steadily pulled them apart in pitch. And when they're about a fifth apart, then you can start to hear them as two streams. So you could start to pick out, you have no hope, even if I played it to you again now you know what they are, you would not be able to recognize them at the beginning. What that's showing you is that there are things that definitely are in the signal, you can measure them, that you can't hear because of the way we process music. J.S. Bach knew this. He uses this in many of his solo instrument pieces to enable there to be a bass line and a tune perceptually at the same time. Quite hard to play, but it's doable. Okay, so the point there is just to show you how psychological music is. How much longer have I got? Because I started late, didn't I? Another 5 minutes, okay. Right, I'm going to have to edit a little bit because I'm running behind. Let's see what else I've got. Okay, right, so having said that, here are some things we can do wrong. Are they horses? I'm not sure if they're horses, but anyway. I'm deliberately omitting the names of the guilty here. 2005, study done with various different non-perceptual models and perceptual models in MIR. Signal processing experiment, and there was a ground truth, and we all know that there are problems with them, and the inclusion of the perceptual models made things worse. Okay, that was a reported result. Now, the person who wrote that originally did not say that that was a problem with perceptual models. He said it was a problem with his perceptual models, which is absolutely fine. However, I have seen at least 2 citations of that work by other authors who say, well, this perceptual stuff is a load of nonsense because that paper said they didn't work. Shocking. So we really don't want to be doing that kind of thing. This is something that archaeologists say all the time. They have to keep reminding themselves. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, which is kind of what's going on up there, or something like that. I don't know. It just means that the measures used weren't good enough. And we really need to think carefully about what we read. OK, here's another one, naive importing of ideas. Now, I showed you earlier on this schematic of some work where the same model works for music and language. And there is a whole bunch of literature out there about the relationship between music and language as cognitive processes. It's very important, and there's plenty of evidence that they actually they share cognitive resources, so that if you're doing one musical task, then your linguistic tasks are compromised and vice versa. Stuff like this. I recommend Annie Patel's book on this. It's very, very good. OK, so it doesn't mean, that's clearly the case, it doesn't mean, though, that they have all the same properties. And this is, some people here will know this is a particular rant of mine. So some time back, I don't know, about halfway through the last decade, people started talking about a semantic gap. The tasks could be done to about 70%, machine learning methods mostly, but we couldn't get beyond 70%. And the answer was that there was a semantic gap between the audio signal and the correct answer, or something. OK. Well-meaning, but ill-informed. Semantics means meaning. Language has meaning. I can say the bottle of water is on the table, and I've been meaning to do this for some time now. Excuse me. In language, but you can't write me a melody that says that. Sorry, you just can't. OK, so that's what semantics is about. It's making claims about things in the world that are truth functional. There are lots of other kinds of meaning. Pragmatic, effective, contextual, social. I can say, oh, the bottle is on the table. Or I can say, hey, the bottle's on the table. And I can convey all sorts of meaning, which is not it's not propositional, it's not there. But music does those things. It doesn't do the basic thing. It doesn't do semantics. If we call it a semantic gap, then what are we going to do? We're going to mislead our young colleagues who are students, who are going to think, oh, yeah, the older, cleverer people said that, so it must be right. We should be very, very careful. Of course, there's a gap, but it's not semantic, it's syntactic. It's about structure. It's about not pulling out what the notes are before you try and work out what the melody is. It's about not pulling out what the chords are before you try and look at the chord sequence, and so on and so forth. The things that music theory has names for that I referred to earlier, that everybody hears, whether they like it or not, that constitutes what music is. Here's a rant about that. This is an entire paper which is a rant. So, right, I've said this so many times now, I'm not going to say it anymore, but there's an interesting point that I just want to pick up on here from Geraint's talk, this question of subjectivity and evaluation. So, for music, if we're talking about the kind of music that humans want to listen to, then we have aesthetics for that. And the aesthetics are at least partly defined in terms of these perceptual primitives that I've been talking about. So if we want a system which is going to be able to create music or do something useful with music, and it has to evaluate itself. So I'm not talking about now about us evaluating our science. I'm talking about the system evaluating itself, a reflective system, which is what we need in computational creativity. Then where are we going to get the subjectivity if it's not human? What does it mean for a computer to have an aesthetic? I'll just leave that one with you, because we've got a real problem there, in that, well, for one thing, it seems pretty likely that computers of this nature are not conscious, so they don't feel. And aesthetics is about feeling, for a start, by definition. But even if you're prepared to accept that a simulation of an aesthetic is a valid subjective aesthetic, then whose aesthetic are we going to simulate? Well, the only one we've got is the human one. So then we kind of come back full circle. So even though what Geraint was saying was absolutely correct, and the thing about unbiased observers not being human and so on, there's still this very big unanswered question about where the hell is any kind of aesthetic that isn't human going to come from. OK, then maybe we can model what music means. So, to summarize, we can build a research program. This is a horse. Research programs that build models can be usefully hierarchical, and I've proposed a way that we can take steps through that hierarchy if we are careful about what we do. Of course, not everybody has to do all of those different steps, and if we have the hierarchy, if we make the hierarchy explicit, then we can cross-correlate, as it were. We can locate our work with respect to other people's. Accuracy, done with care. We must think about what we're doing. We should have a theory, and then we should do our research on the basis of that theory, not just throw tools at data. And then we have to make sure we're modeling the right horse, not something which is out there, but something which is in here, in my case. We need a faithful representation. That's my favorite expression there. A faithful representation of that which is modeled. Otherwise, we're going to be a laughingstock. That's the end. Thank you.